All right, so I guess I'll get us started. Welcome everybody to the Analysis of Wargames panel. What we'll do is we'll have each of us as we start our part of the discussion. We'll do a brief introduction of ourselves, and then we'll carry on with our aspect. And then at the very end, we'll take questions. So the first person that we're going to have talk is Mr. Eric Berry. From the AFC Threats Group, and he'll introduce himself. And we do need slides up. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Paul and Jeff, for the invite to participate. So, as Paul said, I'm Eric Berry. I'm the Chief of Scenarios and Studies Detachment with the AFC Director of Intelligence and Security. So, next slide, please. So, if you think of us as the AFC's G2, though we don't use the usual general staff nomenclature. So what's our role? Well, we provide future OE and threat across AFC primarily. We support Army RDA in particular. And our primary mission areas are threefold. It's the supporting track and the development of AFC analytics scenarios, study support, and in wargaming and experimentation. And almost all of them are in support of track as our primary customer, though we do support others such as SMDC and RCyber and others. Now, the reason I'm participating is we provide threat support to wargaming primarily through track. Now, our threat products, what we develop and portray is nearly 100% based on IC validated projections. We have very, very carefully defined left and right limits in each of our mission areas to ensure the pedigree of what we develop is known. What we develop is furthermore, it's nested within a set of guidance that starts with administration delivered national level strategic guidance all the way down to parent joint scenarios that help set the conditions for the scenario work and the threat that we develop. One of the key parts of what we do that's relevant here is that we work closely with track to help them develop the right measurement space for their studies, and we help them craft the study or experiment design to get to the specific learning demands or objectives. What we do is mandated by regulatory requirements. These range from federal law all the way to MACOM, Army and MACOM level regulations. All of our sources are primarily the service and national level production centers, so that the threat that we develop and apply in all the range of our missions is again focused is derived from what the US IC says is the official projection for the threat. So everything is within the context of an operational environment. And one of the things that we do that's unique, we take the intelligence products, we turn it into threat. We operationalize it within the context of scenarios and future threat operations. And then lastly, big part of what we do, we contribute to the development, I've mentioned it, all of the operational and dynamic scenarios that track produces, both at the entity level and aggregate level representation in the M&S tools that track uses and others. So that's very important, particularly for the tools that the wargaming experimentation uses. Next slide, please. All right, this is my last slide. I'll get out of here quick. We're changing a lot of what we do in support of wargaming, and what I'm about to speak to is really specific to our organization and what we do for DOIS, and many others are probably doing some of this, but this is specific to how we support track in their wargaming. The changing nature of the wargaming that we're participating in is significant. And track's participation has greatly increased, and so therefore ours has as well. what we're seeing is a great increase in the technical and conceptual complexities of the wargaming events or experimentation events themselves. It's going to require a very much focused design for our wargaming team, as well as approach to how we research, how we develop and represent the threat in these events. We see that no longer can we provide a red commander or a supporting analyst and provide and make that adequate to support a war game. Our intent is to develop a very focused red team that has well ahead of the event studied the learning demands, studied the requirements, and we build a team that's focused on providing a staff that you can see here, similar in some ways to the blue staff, that provides, for example, a CMAS me if we have a real focus on that in an event, and of course an analyst who is a fires SME or an A2AD SME that's providing that expertise in the planning and execution and response through the turns. So we're taking a much more deliberate, focused approach. That extends to our research and how we develop threat capabilities ahead of an event. So we study the concepts or systems that are to be assessed during any kind of a war game or an event. We're looking very closely at how can we attack and exploit any of the vulnerabilities of a particular concept. Even if it's not a vulnerability, there are going to be links and nodes we can target. There are going to be seams within the concept, within the employment of particular advanced systems. So we're going in to an event with a much more deliberate approach that looks at how we can disrupt the Army's employment of the aim point force, how they're employing the advanced systems that are currently described in the 31+4, and just taking we're trying to focus more as not just a supporting tool for a war game event, but as a real interactive team that's taken a very focused approach on providing the threats detailed employment. This is going to extend also to how we approach the daily turns, daily events, any kind of activity related to a war game or experiment. And we think that by just requesting a little more time in the daily events and the turns, we all know how valuable time is to all the staffs during an event. Well, we may need a few more minutes, but the payoff will be significant as we develop more detailed planning for the threat, in both in meeting our commander's objectives as well as meeting the objectives of the event itself. This is going to help in many ways. The blue twos that are participating, they're going to have a more accurate understanding of the threat picture, and in particular, I think this is going to help white cell functionality. My most recent experimentation and wargaming experience has been in the white cell, and it's a struggle sometimes to assess clearly what blue and red wants to execute. So this will be part of helping the white cell understand exactly what the intent is and what the actions are supposed to achieve. And this is really going to speed things up in the white cell, I believe. And finally, it'll provide much greater clarity for the facilitators who are trying to keep us on track to meet the learning demands, and of course the data collectors who are critical to everything. So what we're trying to do in a nutshell is provide a more event-driven team with a lot more detailed planning that helps in the end get to the event objectives. That's all I've got. I'll stop and I'll be looking for questions. Thank you.
All right, Eric, thank you very much. Now we're going to go to Ken Brown from Trek White Sands.
Hey, thank you, Paul. I just want to begin with thanking everyone on the panel for inviting me to discuss the analysis of wargamings. So, or war games. So the slides I'm going to show are sort of the issues and the challenges that either I've experienced over the past years, or what I'm currently concerned about as I'm thinking about analysis for war games in the future. So a little bit about myself. I'm an ORSA at Track Wismer. I lead a team responsible for scenario, wargaming, and other data collection events focused at supporting studies. Typically, our studies are at the tactical level, so that's brigade and below, and we're focused on some sort of change to future concepts, capabilities, or force design. So the questions I'm going to present, the challenges, are through my particular lens here at Track Wismer. Next slide, please. Okay, so the very first thing I'd like to kind of bring out to everyone is when we say analysis, well, what do we mean by analysis? Because as we all know, words mean something, and they mean something very particular to especially to this group of individuals. But I think you also have to take into consideration what does it mean to the other members of the team, senior leaders, etc. Those are two examples from two very two people that are very important in the wargaming community, both from Peter Perla and then from Matthew Caffrey. So if you look at the second part that is not highlighted. So again, to me, what does analysis mean in a war game context for everyone? I would argue that we probably could census everyone in the community right now, and we'd probably have a little bit different definition of what analysis means. Not to mention who the client is, and of course, no two clients are the same. And that probably, I think we need to do a little thought about that. What exactly do we mean by analysis? Is analysis limited to just player decisions instead of traditionally science and mathematics? Does it need to change, or do we at least need to think about how we're going to conduct analysis using more, I would say, again, I don't want to say the term hard science, but using more from a sort of a mathematical point of view. What's the expectation from analysis of war games? And what I mean by that is that's the expectation in terms of analysis from everyone involved in the process. I think that's really important to include the person developing the scenarios, to threat, to the data collectors, to the design and developer of the game, all the way to the senior leaders, and probably everyone in between there. And then, of course, what steps need to be taken to ensure that everyone involved in that process has a common understanding of the analysis. I think that is really, and it's probably a fairly, harsh statement at the bottom, but I truly believe that understanding analysis is really the responsibility of everyone involved in the process. At the end of the day, the war game, and I'm speaking to the choir on this, is, we're producing data, and you do analysis on data. If you don't have that data, you're not doing analysis, or if that data is the wrong data, then the analysis may not hit the mark of what you're trying to do. And because a wargaming process it requires, it's multiple people doing multiple things across a period of time to produce data. I believe that everyone has to have a clear understanding of what the analysis of the war game is trying to do, so that you don't have any particular failure point within that process to ensure that the senior leaders are getting at the answer that they've requested the event coordinator, the study lead, to execute. Next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so what do I think the current challenges are? This by no means is an exhaustive list, and you'll see. But so that first box, or sort of the big challenges I've been thinking about lately. What analysis is valuable to senior leaders? What type and kind of analysis is required for these future studies that we're looking at? The way we traditionally have done analysis, is that value valuable to future, study issues and concerns. And then finally, how can we provide, quote, and I know we probably cringe with this, but more analytical results. So the reason why I think those are challenges is because what we're seeing in the environment, or at least from my foxhole, is, we have reduced resources. So that means reduced timelines. We have a probably, as senior leaders come up and then they rotate out, there may be an unrealistic expectation that I need something quickly. I need some sort of evidence to support some sort of decision. And we just don't have the time to do a combat simulation. But the expectation is, well, a war game is a tool, and I can get the same information from that. So I think that is, those are the kinds of concerns we have to think about. I don't believe that timelines are getting any longer. I don't think resources are getting any more. And I think from this community, we're going to be underneath even more pressure to produce the kind of product or the analysis that's going to resonate with a senior leader. So if we know at the end of a war game, the following questions could be asked, what can we do to prepare? To me, these are the types of questions that I have heard before from senior leaders. Did we win or not? How valuable was this new capability? What are the metrics produced from the war game? Why didn't capability X have a greater effect? All of those types of questions. Now, I recognize that the definition of a war game is and I'm taking this from Peter Perla. Exploring the consequences of human decision making. I understand that. This community understands that. But do senior leaders understand that? Or is that what they're expecting, this tool that they say, hey, I know that this tool is going to be valuable for me. Do they understand that this tool is somewhat, and I don't want to say limited, but it's very specific. So if we know those questions are going to get asked at the end of a war game, then what do we need to do to sort of prepare to answer those questions? And as we all, I'm sure, have found out, we can't say, well, sir, this was the wrong tool, because resources have already been put to that and the expectation has already been set. So my bottom banner, I think we have to continually strategically message those senior leaders and the decision makers to ensure that the right tool, for us would be a war game, can answer the desired questions. I don't think we can wait for that. And at the same time, I think that there may be unique ways in which we can get closer to meeting their expectations through wargaming, recognizing that a war game is not a simulation, or I should say is not a combat simulation. Subject to questions, I yield to the floor.
All right, Ken. Those are, I love those questions and the slides you put together. Thanks for doing that. All right, now we're going to go to Paul Carney from the Center for Army Analysis.
Hi, thanks, Paul. For the team, I am Major Paul Carney. I am the strategist assigned to the Center for Army Analysis, and I'm also a wargame analyst in the Strategic Wargaming Division at CAA. And I'll give a rundown of what we do here at the center, and how that view from our particular foxhole affects what we do and how we do it in the analytic community. So if we could jump to the first slide. So first, for those not particularly familiar, the Center for Army Analysis is a field operating agency of the G8. So we work for HQDA and the G8 as the analytical arm, but really our customers are more wide and varied than just the G8 or HQDA. A lot of things that make us particularly valuable, or we try to make sure that we are particularly valuable to the Army community, are how we support senior leader decision-making and analysis across the spectrum of conflict, from competition and in crisis and in conflict itself, and how we tie into the joint interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational context. We push to the next slide. So where we fit in with folks like Ken Brown and Track and Army Futures Command is at CAA, our focus, instead of being on the brigade and below tactical fight like Ken just briefed, we are at the theater warfighting level. So we're looking at providing support to ASCCs, to the Army Service Component Commands, Combatant Commands, and the Headquarters Department of the Army primarily. And that level of war and where we're looking at focusing our war games fundamentally changes how we do things here versus how other groups might be looking at wargaming and wargaming analysis. So these differences in level of war aren't just what we consider, for our clients and the senior leaders that come to us, but it also affects the methods and methodologies we use for that. So without going into too much detail, because I've read most of the books that the other panelists have put out on wargaming to train myself up, but our basic methodologies that we look at in strategic wargaming include things like structured seminars, matrix gaming, pole mill gaming, and we also at CAA have a dedicated campaign wargaming division that does rigid and semi-rigid adjudication with things like the Center for Army Analysis advanced warfighting or wargaming system, things like Logjam, which is our logistics war game simulation. Can we push to the next slide? The biggest thing that we wanted to present from the Center for Army Analysis today was just how our wargaming and wargaming capability and focus has really expanded recently. So starting in around 2013 with Indo-PACOM, we've really kind of expanded the number of war games and types of war games that we have done. So on this slide, you see just all of the O plans and current operations war games, and who has sponsored those in the yellow. Some of our policy and strategy focused games that are in the green, and then of course the defense planning scenario development and support that we've done for that. What we're always struggling with, and what we balance at the Center for Army Analysis is the needs of these different sponsors. So as you look on the right side of each of those boxes, you've got levels of units and types of units that are, from the high side of the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Headquarters Department of the Army, down to theater support commands, combatant commands, Army Service Component commands, regional commands, and those different customers require different things. So we work across so many different sponsors. There are a lot of benefits and drawbacks to working across that wide range. One of the things that we do in strategic wargaming is we essentially have to build bespoke games for each of these different sponsors and the senior decision makers. And based on what they're trying to get out of this, there isn't a model that we've built or a gaming system that we've developed that we can plug and play with each of these different sponsors, because it's such a diverse set. But the nice thing about having this diverse set of sponsors is that we're able to pull insights and perspectives from across different combatant commands, approaches that are Army-centric as we look to Army customers, that are joint perspectives, and we have the resident knowledge and capability here at the Center for Army Analysis, because we've had all of these touch points and this widespread, that we can pull some of those things into coordination with each other as we look to war game out a lot of the decision space that these senior leaders are looking into. So lastly, before I sign off and take any questions that folks have, we'll just take a look at what things that we're going to be focusing on over the near future. One of the biggest that we've been working quite a bit is a war game that might not fall into the traditional definitions of wargaming. And one of the things that we're doing right now is our new regionally aligned modernization and manning model, the Army's rearm system, and how we are gaming that out for senior leaders, and then all the different stakeholders in that, to include the Army's G1, the National Guard, and Office of the Chief of the Army Reserve, so that they can see how these new modernization and manning models will impact and affect those different stakeholders across the Army enterprise. We're also doing things more related to what the Army Futures Command and Ken Brown was talking about, looking at the waypoint and aim point time horizons. Globally integrated war game is something we're supporting for the Joint Staff, and wargaming for competition and a global strategic framework. So of course, all these things that we do in the different stakeholders, the important takeaway is a focus on what these senior leaders and these decision makers are trying to get out of the war game and building the war game in order to support those particular interests. So with that, stand open for any questions as we take them at the end.
Alrighty, thanks, Paul. Yeah, the one thing I've always liked about what you guys do is we're usually, our analyses are 2 or 3 levels away from the soldier, and some of the stuff you're talking about, you guys are directly impacting O plans and stuff. It's slick, fun, satisfying. All right, so here's my slide. I'm Paul Works. I'm from the Research Analysis Center at Fort Leavenworth. I'm one of the directors there. I've been doing wargaming for a long time, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about where I've seen wargaming, how wargaming is used, both when I work for the Navy and for TRAC. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I have 2 slides. The first one is why we would use a war game in analysis, and I'll give you a little bit of background about how TRAC uses it. So we use, as Ken noted, a little bit of repetition here, but we use war games to do operational scenario development, as Eric Berry also said, and you can see the kinds of applications we use it in, rock drills and map hexes. And then we use war games to directly support studies. So we'll look at where we can't answer a study issue or some measures of merit or essential data requirement with other kinds of MMT. We apply war games to gather those data. One of the typical structures that we use at TRAC to formulate a problem and the tool suite that we want to apply to that study is this measurement space construct. And you can see that. So there's the diagram is over on the right, and really the measurement space is that white kind of triangle thing in the middle, where it's the overlap between where the problem is, what conditions the problems exist under, and then the solutions that are applicable to both those the problems and conditions. And so for war games, when you have a kind of a weakly structured problem where you don't fully understand aspects that you try to get a tight problem statement for the study, but that's not the same as the challenges that are associated with conducting the operations or applying whatever system you're using or examining. You don't fully understand the aspects of that problem, and so war games can help you examine that. You can also use the war games. They can illuminate the aspects of the conditions under which those problems exist. So, for example, there may be a set of conditions that are causing the problem, and then if you change the conditions slightly, Does that make the problem worse or better, or what's that dynamic, that conflated dynamic between that overlap that you haven't identified in the beginning? And then also the solutions, where emergent every war game I've done, there have been emergent solutions across DOTML, and sometimes they're synergistic. It may be a doctrine / materiel combination, or maybe some combination of those things to mitigate some pieces of the problems. And so this, and then also aspects of what attributes of the solutions really are the beneficial to problem mitigation. You may say, like we often get proposals like, hey, here's this helicopter that's going to mitigate some problem in some, in EUCOM. Okay, well, what about that? So what about that helicopter? This new proposal is actually mitigating the problem. And so when we decompose the actual solution into the component elements or attributes to examine those. Then as we build out this measurement space construct, one of the things we also do is we develop this data collection management plan. And that is a structured thing that links study issues all the way down to every piece of data that you're supposed to be collecting. And there are often cases where we'll want to run a model or simulation, a closed form simulation, to get hardcore quantitative data, but we don't know how the systems or technologies will be used in the future. And so what we do is we play a war game to get that information that we then use as decision tables or behaviors for our entities in our more closed forms models. And so that we use it that way. Now, I also believe that you can get, if you design your war game right, you can get some quantitative data out. And in fact, Ken touched on that earlier, to examine specific data elements. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this next slide ties in with that piece. So when you think about a study, often you'll have a number of different independent variables. So you'll have different kinds of courses of action, different alternatives, for example, different conditions under which those things exist, those problems exist, and then you'll have different ways to apply those solutions, those courses of actions to apply those solutions. And often, when I do a war game, I prefer it to be stochastic, so it's not like a closed form expected value thing. It's a stochastic thing where somebody's rolling dice, or there's some probability thing in an adjudication tool. And not just for adjudication, you may have probabilities and detections and whatnot that are not specifically combat adjudication, or some kind of non-combat like competition activity adjudication. And then also typically war game resources are limited. Like often when we do a war game, we can only get everybody together, 30 uniform guys and the 30 analysts all together for a couple of weeks, and that's it. So how many war game runs can you do during those 2 weeks is always a challenge. And so what we do inevitably, and I did this at China Lake for air-to-air combat studies, and I do it at TRAC, is we do design of experiments. And you can do a design of experiments either in a hardcore sense, like using the stuff in the left-hand diagram, some kind of very structured design of experiments application, or you can do a little bit looser, but using the same kind of guidelines. And the main guideline that we use is, there are two pieces to that. One is try to get the independent variables as orthogonal as possible. That means try to get them independently examined, but often you can't get them completely orthogonal. And second, try to look at the same set of solutions and conditions from different viewpoints, so you get multiple views at the same thing simultaneously. And so that's what we did, for example, in the civil affairs study we recently did, where we had we had strategic and operational and tactical level problems in different category areas. And so we looked at all those blue boxes in there. All the rows are all the different possible iterations, for example, in a design of experiments. And so the blue boxes are an example of how we tried to get an orthogonal set looking at the same challenges in different areas. And so that's the way we do it. If you smartly design that design of experiments, if you smartly construct that, I do believe you can get some quantitative data out of there. It requires some pretty robust data capture, but you can do that if you get enough runs. For example, in this civil affairs thing, you can see that each one, if you multiply the columns, there's 12 columns, but each one of those columns represented 3 war games. So there was 36. We did 36 actual games that week, and so at the end, we did have some statistics, but you gotta caveat that with the narrative that you're building out from what's going on in the game. And so for me, looking at this bottom bullet here, it's examining those indeterminate pieces, those unknowns, where the human interact with the changes you're making. And so for me, it's always the main outputs are the player decisions and the narratives that you build from the war game. And then if you can get some quantitative data to add to that, that's great. And I've had cases where the quantitative data supported the narrative, and then there are cases where the quantitative data did not exactly support the narrative. And so what that led us to do is examine why that was the case. It led us to more discovery of nuances of the problem and solutions. All right, that's all I have. So thanks, and we'll go to Andrew Reddy from Sandia.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Paul. We can bring down the slide deck if we want. I decided to, you can find all of our slide products on the likes of OSTI and I think also the Connections website. But instead of boring you with a series of regression models, I thought I would speak to what I view as the promise, the challenge, and then kind of the analytical uses of wargaming methods. And thank you, Paul, for stepping in to moderate here. As you mentioned, I'm a senior engineer at Sandia National Labs and a postdoc at UC Berkeley. Among the arts, craft, to use your term, Jeff, and science cadre inside the wargaming community, I am probably best known as the science proponent. So that's where I'll probably spend some of my time here today. So with regards to the promise of wargaming for analytical purposes, I think it's well established that we have these educational and training uses for these tools. But when we talk about an analysis, as we've already heard from Ken in particular, analysis can be a bit of a tricky concept. And I think where I have problems with Caffrey and Perla's definition is that it doesn't necessarily need to be quantitative outputs from your wargame products for them to be analytically tractable, useful. In many ways, you can think of a war game like a single case. And so if you were to run a couple of war games with different independent variables varying, right, through that qualitative process tracing, you're going to get perfectly reasonable analytical outputs. So quantification is not the be all and end all. Although I will say that in my work, we're really heavy on statistical methods, right? So I think that's an important distinction. And analytical use to me means, are you using this tool for carrying out causal inference, right? Do you have some set of independent variables that you think are causing some effect of interest? And I think where war games are particularly useful is where we have questions where we don't have empirical data for a variety of reasons, right? So things like new military capabilities, new strategies, new doctrine, right? Things that we don't have, we can't look outside our window and say, okay, I see this, I'm going to collect that data, put it in a data set like Correlates of War, we'll put it in do a comparative case analysis. And so for those types of questions, really useful, right? So to one of John's questions in the chat, right? We have these new cyber capabilities, new hypersonic capabilities, how they actually impact things like conflict escalation, strategic stability, right, is an unknown. And so wargaming is a really useful tool for unpacking that, particularly compared to existing data generating processes, what I call DGPs, right? So modeling and simulation tools, including game theory, have been around for a very long time. The major problem that we have with those tools is that they take the human out of the equation. And a lot of the things that we're interested in, a la crisis dynamics, the human's really important, right? We are warm, squishy things who do weird stuff. And so we need data generating processes to put the human back in. And so the way that, my community, I come from social science, political science, the way that my community usually deals with this is via survey experiments, right? Where the humans are the data generating process. Of course, surveys have a big problem too, right? Which is that I give you a piece of paper and then ask for it back 10 minutes later, and it matters not, right, to your life what you answered A, B, C, or D. But inside of a wargaming environment, right, if I plug you in for an hour or 2 or 3, right, all of a sudden the stakes go up, right? The stakes aren't the same as the real world, absolutely, right? And war games don't last forever, and that's a problem because you have the distinction between iterative and non-iterative environments, right? But that all said, we at least have something to go on here when we're doing wargaming, where we're putting people inside of an immersive environment. And indeed, I think in the way that we've approached our work at Sandia, we try to triangulate findings across different data generating processes. So you will often see an analytical war game paired with a survey experiment, or paired with a formal model. Actually drawing on some of that, I think I saw Markovian modeling in the chat, right? That's actually one of the ways in which we do it. So that's the kind of promise, right? For those questions where we don't have empirical data, here's this really neat tool where we can actually start to think about causal inference. The challenge is that the way that we've been doing wargame traditionally is often overwhelmingly inside of one-shot wargame designs. Obviously, Paul just mentioned his where he did 36 through, right? That's a little bit different. But oftentimes we're bringing former or current high-level policymakers around the table, having them play through ones. And here I want to make a distinction that is often not made, which is that there's process-oriented inference and outcome-oriented inference. It's perfectly reasonable in my mind to take those experts around the table and ask, well, okay, instead of a Baltic Sea scenario, is missile defense a conversation that's being had over the table, right? That is an outcome that you get from the data, right? That is the speech around the table. It is not tractable analytically to say that out of this one war game, we saw this happen in the Baltic Sea. Therefore, in the real world, this is going to happen in the Baltic Sea. Because you have all the idiosyncrasies that come from any number of things inside of the way that we do war game design. It comes from your sample, right? Who's playing? Often we have homogeneous samples, and that's not necessarily a good thing, right? It comes from the design of the war game. Often we're using white cells to do adjudication. If you get a particularly angry white cell, that's going to impact the game outcome. And obviously, doing comparability, even if you are able to play 36 games, you have different white cells in each. You're not comparing apples and oranges, right? So that's a pretty significant challenge as well. And so, when we're talking about one-shot war games, I would much rather that we focus more on the process-oriented inference side rather than the outcome, because I think a couple of us have managed to get in a little bit of trouble saying, well, this is how AI impacts conflict, right? Or this is how AI impacts NC3, not to pick on anybody in particular. And we can't really do that with war game designs unless we're triangulating across different data generating processes. So I think we need to think hard about how to employ wargaming with generalizability in mind. And that's where my team spends a lot of time, right? So we build replicable wargame environments. I think the most well-known is Signal, where we have 425 games for analysis, which still, to the best of my knowledge, is the largest wargaming data set, right? And there you have a rules-based adjudication system, no white cell, and what have you. So that's some of the challenges that we need to face. Thinking about war games in a positivist paradigm, I think there's a lot of space to use war games for case analysis, right? Again, qualitative, not quantitative. A lot of space to explore counterfactuals, right? It's particularly around these new capabilities, and a lot of space to employ statistical methods. And so in our work, we're really heavy on regressions, hazard models, and what have you. And I'm happy to pull up slides and show you that if you want to be bored by regression tables. And to John's question in the chat, how do you deal with uncertainty? That comes out of the modeling specification that you're using, right? So if you're using a logit model, you have very specific controls that you need to run to make sure that you're dealing with uncertainty and getting the p-values out and making sure that you're testing for type 1, type 2 errors, et cetera, right? And so that's driven entirely by the modeling specification that you're using. One of the things that I think is really neat from an analyst perspective about wargaming data compared to the other tools available for us to carry out social science is that wargames give us multiple levels of analysis. I have game outcomes. I have player decision-making. I have temporal data across rounds, right? And any combination thereof. And that's really, really interesting. In a survey, I get the answers the players are providing, right? But now I get to put people inside of an interactive setting where strategic dynamics are important. And that's really neat. Also, too, I think there's an increasing amount of space in the field for us to think about not individuals in gameplay, but teams in gameplay, given that a lot of the things that we're interested in around crises and conflict, right, requires teams in situation rooms to actually make decisions. And then, of course, as I mentioned, these tools can be usefully integrated with the entire toolkit. There's no reason that we only answer a question with a war game. We can answer it with a war game and a survey, with a war game and a formal model, right? Particularly where we don't have empirical data, there's no way for us to check whether the war game is quote unquote right? The burden for external validity doesn't exist. We're answering questions where there's no observables. And so I think, thinking hard about how they integrate with game theoretical models, with computer simulations, with survey experiments is a really important thing for us to be doing. But overall, I think one of the reasons I'm here is that I'm terribly excited by the potential of the method to add to the toolkit. And delighted to be on this panel with a lot of folks that, Jeff, I got your book right here. A lot of folks that, I look up to in the field. And, I think there's a lot of space for us to move the field forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I took a ton of notes from you. I love a lot of the stuff you're talking about. Thanks. All right. Now Dr. Applegood out at NPS will close us out here with this.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's great to go last because what I heard from every one of you were some of the best practices embodied in the work you're doing and the way your organizations approach wargaming. Great to hear Eric Berry. I didn't realize as a track analyst until after I left track what a great resource to have dedicated red teams to make sure the wargaming that's done by track and others has the right threat. There's a best practice right there that we don't do all too often, is make sure the reds represented great. So that was great to hear Eric talk. It's great to hear Paul Carney at CAA talk about, geez, it'd be nice if we had a template, but there's no template because every war game is different, depends on what the sponsor's looking for. So it's great to hear such great wargaming being done all around. So for me, for those of you who don't know me, retired Army OR analyst, spent 20 of my 30 years as an Army OR analyst, 10 at track, working with Paul Rooks and Ken Brown and other folks. At NPS, I teach an 11-week wargaming course primarily to OR students and DA students, our operations research students and defense analysis students. And that 11-week course is not your typical course. What we do on week one, I form the students into teams of about 5 students each. And then on week 2, I introduce them to their real world sponsor. And from week 2 to week 11, they are working with their sponsor to develop a war game for that sponsor as they're learning wargaming. So it's quite an adventure for them. And at the end of 11 weeks, we have what we call Wargaming Week here at NPS, where the students actually conduct the game for the sponsor, and the sponsors walk away happy for almost all the games, which is great. We've done now 90 games in the 12 years I've been here, and we do war games we have done war games for many DoD organizations, but also for allies and partners too. We did a war game a couple of years ago for Taiwan, looking at some of their newer technologies for the Taiwan Navy. So that's what we did. That's what I do at NPS. We teach that in the fall and in the spring. And then in the summer and the winter, I go on the road and I teach a 5-day version of that course where we go to any organization, any government organization or defense organization that asks us to, and we come on in, and in 5 days, we take a cadre of about 20 students, and on day 1, they get introduced to their sponsor from their organization, and we provide the wargaming education piece of that and all the practical exercises. And on day 5, they're actually conducting about an hour's worth of a war game to demonstrate that they've got it all. So both courses are hands-on, learn by doing. The 5-day course is about 30% lecture and about 70% students working as teams, building those elements of a war game. And I'm glad that Andrew showed the craft of wargaming, because we finally thought, we've done this now for 10 years. Let's put it in a book so we can do good analytic wargaming. Now, I'll differentiate a little bit and say this. There are educational war games out there, and Andrew mentioned it, great educational and training or experiential games out there. they all need rigor. So I'm not going to say they have less rigor in them, but the analytic wargaming needs, in my opinion, a lot of thought to put a rigor behind that. Paul Works talked about measurement space. We talk about that in the craft of wargaming as well. We have to figure out what we need to get to answer those issues that the sponsor's given us. And so approaching that in a structured manner, which is the way we teach it here, is really kind of the key to that, to make sure that we actually can construct a war game that can get get the players to start talking about the issues. And I'm glad Andrew mentioned this. A lot of misperception out there, not only on the part of newer war gamers, but our senior leaders. And I think Ken Brown mentioned the challenges of sponsors, or maybe you all did, that sponsor education is a huge challenge in DoD today, and getting them to understand what it takes to put together a good war game. And then if we're doing an analytic war game, we're not going to be giving you charts and numbers for the most part. I mean, we're looking at qualitative data. And it's really fun to take the OR students here at NPS who come to me after 6 quarters of quantitative courses, nonlinear programming, linear programming, statistics, this, that, stochastic processes, and go, we're not looking for numbers here. And it really kind of get the shock look on their face. No, we're looking for qualitative information from players. And yes, analysis can be done with qualitative information. In fact, that's what he's coming to you. A sponsor's coming to you and wants, numerical comparisons of 2 or 3 alternatives. Wargaming is not your tool to use to get those quantitative comparisons. It may be part of the analysis process to get a concept of operations for a new concept or technology that then is fed into a simulation study. But if you see lots of numbers coming out of a war game, I'd be very, very skeptical. So a couple of the other things talking about, so one of the things is best and worst practices. So the Craft of Wargaming book that talks about how we do wargaming at NPS, if you want a template and a checklist on how to do a war game, there's not one. Not that I've found, and if you find one, I'd be very, very suspicious. Instead, we talk about best and worst practices. Fortunately, in DoD, I'm seeing more best practices and less worst practices than 10 years ago. But we've still got some challenges to overcome. And sponsor education is a big piece of that. Who was it? Was it Ken talking about, or whoever was talking about, is earlier on Eric Berry talking about some of the senior leaders now. The 4-stars were younger than he is. Yeah, I've lived that dream too. I've got 4-star classmates that are already retired as 4-stars. In fact, I think they've been retired for about 10 years now. But so our young senior leaders now don't get it. And so you have to educate them about what a war game is, what a simulation study is, and how they're different. And that and it still takes time to put together a war game. And we're fighting on a couple of fronts there, us wargaming practitioners, to try and get those points home, because we still have a lot of not so great wargaming being done in different places. And it was really great to see Paul Carney slide and seeing him go out to help these co-coms, because part of the motivation in fact, the big motivation for the book that I and Rob Brooks and Fred Cameron wrote was to help DoD practitioners do better wargaming. We did our 5-day course out at some of the co-coms, about 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And what I saw was not very impressive. In fact, it was downright scary. We have co-coms that are developing plans that are going to sit on a shelf and might be executed in 5 or 10 years. And they haven't been wargamed in reality, haven't been wargamed well, even for one course of action, much less the 3 that they should have been doing some kind of analysis on before they decided to write their plan. So DoD needs some help. It's getting better. And hopefully the Craft of Wargaming will help them do that. But with sponsor education, happened to be writing a chapter for a Marine Corps University publication on sponsor education. And you all have wrestled with it as well. Our sponsors need to know what it takes to do a good war game, the difference between a war game and a combat simulation, and the fact that they need to engage and help us understand their problem before we run off in a corner with some half-baked or kind of very flaky, vague and conflicting guidance. That's usually what you get from senior leaders. I practice it myself. Paul Works can tell you about that, but we get that from our sponsors as well. And if you don't go back and engage the sponsor, and some of us analysts who don't like the personal interaction want to go off with a half-baked problem and then fit your own way of solving it into their half-baked problem. And, many of you in the room have gone back and, 6 months later, here's senior leader, here's the product you asked for. And the senior leader goes, that's not what I wanted. And so one of the first best practices of wargaming is you got to get into the sponsor's head and figure out what it is they really want. Probably your first interaction will only go halfway at best to figuring that out. And if you can't re-engage them, that's where sometimes wargames break down as well. So I'll end my remarks there. Happy to answer questions. I saw a question about game theory in wargame analysis. Yeah, I think anything can be used in wargaming analysis, but with game theory, you got to start looking at, okay, what's the challenges of the game theory? We're trying to break decisions down into a little bit of a template, and you're looking at different values and weighting systems. All that's, all that data, where does that come from and how do you inform that? So I would say, yeah, you could involve game theory, but people sometimes conflate and think war games are constructed on a game theoretic construct. And I've not seen that really done well. It might have happened somewhere, but not in my experience. So that's all I've got for my remarks. Happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Jeff. So I think we'll be putting is one of our moderator facilitators going to be putting the questions up on the board. If not, like in a green banner. If not, we can look at the StreamYard. Let's see. One of the questions. Okay, here we go.
Hey, this is Eric. I'd like to chime in on this question. Yeah, so information age issues, information age capabilities, which means advanced technologies in most cases, are a challenge for us from the threat standpoint. As I mentioned, the vast majority of our work is mandated to use IC validated projections. And so what this means is, regardless of the technologies that are being developed and discussed, if a particular capability is not seen in an IC validated projection, which means it's assessed to be found in some specific system or capability that will be fielded at a given time and place, we tend not to be able to use it at all. So that's one of the big limitations for us is you have a community of practice that talks about technology and capabilities that are coming, but we're generally part of a community that requires hard projections. I'll leave it there. I know time's short. Thank you.
Yeah, in general, I'll just touch on it real quick. So, yeah, we are bringing in cyber and info ops and influence ops into our games. It's not being ignored. Over.
Yeah. So there's a range that we can assess ways to get the effects injected into a particular event, and cyber EW is one. But more advanced capabilities like AI, yeah, that's not so much. We can't do that. Over.
Paul, I can take Ann's question if you'd like. Yeah. So Ann, this is the soapbox that I was on a couple of days ago during my trilemma presentation. But I think if we're using war games as an analytical tool, we need to start being really serious about what the laboratory effects of the environments that we're building are, right? So, I mean, the low-hanging fruit would be, are digital games different from analog games? My prior is probably yes, right? Are 3-player games different from 10-player games? Probably yes, right? Understanding those laboratory effects is really, really important. And one of the dangers of overclassification of the war game design and the data derived from the war game design is that actually unpacking those laboratory effects can be really difficult. Certainly I've spent most of my career as an academic, right? And you just don't have access to war games designs to know what the best practice is. We do rely on books like Jeff's and Peter's, right, and others to really get a sense of what it is what designs have actually been implemented in the past, because you don't get to pick up the books. And I think one of the things that our team's trying to do is, okay, with Signal, we publish the game manual, and we hope that scholars who are maybe younger or postdocs will pick up that game design, manipulate small things inside that design, and tell us what the laboratory effects might be, right? And obviously we'll do that too in our own designs, but having that transparency actually allows us to get those laboratory effects out.
Yeah, for me too, it's about documenting. That often when we do it's not, let's say not often, but not uncommon for us to run a war game and not document how it was really executed. We'll document the outputs, but we will not try. And so creating this consistency, that creates a problem if you can't go back and look at how it was really executed. Over.
Yeah, and Paul, if I can chime in for Ann's question too. So we've wrestled with this as well, trying to get standardized documentation. And as you can imagine, when the students are done conducting a war game and now they're getting ready to graduate, it's like, you still got to document what you did. So we've got an executive summary out there that we've iterated on over the years. And it at least is a decent framework, I believe, for communicating to folks not only what you've learned, but the context within which those answers were produced. So it's about a 5 or 6 paragraph executive summary, but it starts with who are the players, what kind of game construct did you use, and what was the scenario, and then you get the final outputs and not the results, I'll call them findings, and we think that's a best practice. You'll see those in our quarterly report. If you don't subscribe to it, shoot me an email, and we can get you on there as long as you're DoD, U.S. government. But yeah, current repositories, I think, and right now, current repositories aren't really demanding any kind of great documentation in a great format. I think the executive summary would go some ways toward getting you there. And if folks would do that, that would be great. I think I've got a repository now of about 50 or so of the 100 games. We didn't start early on doing executive summaries, and I started beating the students up to get that out of them too. But I think that's a best practice as well, figuring out exactly what the report looks like and how to communicate to others, not only the results, but the context within which those results were produced.
So from the Center for Army Analysis, we actually have quite a robust system where we capture not just the outputs of our war games, but internally we capture the methodologies used and the processes and the decisions that we made to build these games. And for me, being a very new war gamer, that's been very helpful for me as I develop some of my first games, because you get that first, as Andrew was saying, perhaps more academic step of a literature review of the games themselves, so that you're not you're building from whole cloth. You're able to build on the ideas and borrow and pilfer from everything from the hobby games that we grew up on to the more analytical games that have been conducted in the past, and we don't lose all that value. So not only having a consistent way to capture that so that they could be more easily referenced, but having a larger repository across the DoD would be incredibly useful, so we're not tilling the same soil.
All right, thanks, guys. I think I have been notified that we need to start wrapping this thing up. I know we could sit in a room and talk for hours. I wish we could do that at some point, but I really appreciate you guys, every one of you, participating, and it's been a great discussion. And encourage anybody to shoot one of these guys or more of them emails if you have more questions. And thanks for listening in.